What starts as a routine flight from New York to Los Angeles quickly spirals into a high-stakes battle for survival and truth. Captain Jack Coleman, a seasoned pilot, boards Flight 428 as a passenger, eager for a rare moment of relaxation. But before the plane even leaves the tarmac, Jack finds himself caught in a whirlwind of prejudice and suspicion when a flight attendant questions his presence in first class. What appears to be a simple misunderstanding soon reveals hidden dangers lurking beneath the surface. A mysterious note, 3 passengers with a secret, and a shadowy figure who vanishes mid-flight. Each twist pulls Jack deeper into a conspiracy that threatens the lives of everyone on board. And when an experimental device smuggled into the cargo bay begins to destabilize, Jack must confront not only his own past, but a ticking clock that leaves no room for error. What would you do if every decision you made carried the weight of hundreds of lives? Would you stand against impossible odds or fold under the pressure? Jack Coleman adjusted the straps of his leather carry-on and entered the luxurious first-class cabin of Flight 217, a direct route from New York to Los Angeles. For the first time in years, he wasn't in the cockpit. Dressed in a simple polo and khakis, the seasoned pilot had decided to take this trip as a passenger, eager to enjoy a rare moment of leisure. Yet, as he settled into the plush comfort of his assigned seat, the buzz of boarding passengers faded into the background, replaced by a creeping tension. "Excuse me, sir," a voice cut through the hum of conversation. Jack looked up to see a petite flight attendant, her name tag reading Emily. Her polite smile faltered, her eyes scanning him with hesitation. "Yes?" Jack asked, his tone neutral. "I believe there's been an error," she said, holding out her hand for his boarding pass. Jack complied, watching her expression shift as she examined the ticket. "This seat is reserved for first-class passengers," Emily continued, her voice lowering as passengers nearby perked up. "You'll need to move to the economy section." Jack's brow furrowed. "That's my seat. There's no mistake." Emily's smile tightened, and the unspoken implication hung in the air. Around them, whispers began to ripple through the cabin. Jack recognized the tension, an all-too-familiar discomfort rooted in judgment, assumptions, and appearances. As Jack stood to address the growing situation, he caught sight of another passenger discreetly raising their phone to film the interaction. Who was this person, and why did they seem so intent on documenting his humiliation? "I'd like to speak to the captain," Jack stated firmly. Emily hesitated, shifting her weight uncomfortably. "The captain is busy preparing for departure." "I'll wait," Jack replied, his voice calm but resolute. The weight of every nearby gaze bore down on him, yet he stood tall. What Jack didn't know was that this confrontation was just the beginning. Beyond the indignity of the moment, forces were at play that threatened not only his pride, but the very integrity of the flight itself. Hidden truths, personal agendas, and shocking revelations would soon take this journey far beyond the ordinary. As Emily retreated to consult with her crew, Jack resumed his seat, his mind racing with questions. Why was he singled out? What role did the passenger with the phone play? And what secrets lay ahead on a flight that had already veered off course before it even left the ground? The answers were waiting, just beyond the cockpit door. The hum of the cabin filled Jack's ears as he sat in the economy seat he had begrudgingly accepted. He clenched his jaw, his thoughts racing back to the smug look Emily had tried to mask when she told him to move. The luxury of the first-class cabin now felt like a distant memory. His mind buzzed with one persistent question: why him? Jack opened his book, trying to distract himself. Yet, his peripheral vision caught the glint of a smartphone camera 2 rows ahead. The same passenger who had filmed the earlier interaction was now discreetly aiming their lens his way, pretending to scroll casually. Jack leaned forward slightly, catching their gaze. The passenger, a young man in his 20s with unkempt hair and a hoodie, flinched, hastily lowering his phone. But it was too late. The camera's red recording light was unmistakable. You've been watching me since I boarded, Jack said quietly, his voice firm but devoid of aggression. Care to explain why? The man hesitated, glancing around as if searching for an escape route. Finally, he sighed and leaned closer. Look, I wasn't trying to be nosy. My name's Ryan. I work for an online investigative channel. I document things like, discrimination, bias, unfair treatment. I couldn't help noticing what just happened to you back there. Jack's eyes narrowed. And what exactly do you plan to do with that footage? Ryan hesitated. It depends. Stories like these blow up all the time. People need to see how this stuff still happens. I mean, a guy like you? He faltered, suddenly aware of his own biases. I mean, it's just wrong. Jack studied him, his instincts honed from years of managing high-stakes situations in the cockpit. He recognized sincerity in Ryan's fumbling explanation, but also a potential risk. You don't even know the full story, Jack said. And you're ready to turn it into a headline? Ryan shrugged. That's why I wanted to talk to you, to understand what's going on. Before Jack could respond, Emily reappeared, moving briskly through the aisle. She avoided making eye contact with Jack, but stopped a few rows ahead to speak with another crew member. Jack noticed her gesturing towards the cockpit, her expression fraught with tension. Ryan leaned in again. That's the same flight attendant who moved you, right? She's been pacing back and forth since takeoff. Something's up. Jack followed Ryan's gaze. Emily was indeed agitated, her whispers sharp and hurried. When she glanced back towards Jack's row, her face paled, as if she had been caught in the act. I need to talk to the captain, Jack muttered, more to himself than to Ryan. Good luck with that, Ryan said. They'll probably stonewall you like they did before. Jack, however, had no intention of being stonewalled. Rising from his seat, he adjusted his posture, his years of command authority returning in an instant. He strode toward the front of the cabin, ignoring Emily's alarmed expression. Sir, you can't be up here, Emily said, stepping into his path. Jack met her gaze with unflinching calm. I'm not just a passenger, Emily. I'm Captain Jack Coleman, and I was scheduled to relieve the flight crew for the second leg. Now either you take me to the cockpit, or I explain this entire situation to the passengers myself. Emily froze, her face pale. The nearby passengers who had overheard gasped audibly. For a moment, it seemed as though she might argue, but something in Jack's tone left no room for debate. I'll notify the captain, Emily stammered, retreating towards the cockpit. As Jack stood in the aisle, waiting, he couldn't shake the feeling that the young journalist was right. Something was deeply wrong on this flight. The answers he sought were just a locked cockpit door away. The murmurs from the passengers behind Jack swelled as Emily disappeared into the cockpit. The tension was palpable, each second stretching longer than the last. Jack stood his ground, arms crossed, every inch of him radiating the authority that came with his years as a captain. Ryan watched from his seat, his phone now resting in his lap, the red recording light still on. The young man gave Jack a subtle nod of encouragement, as if silently urging him to push forward. Moments later, the cockpit door cracked open, and a tall man with salt and pepper hair emerged. His captain's uniform was crisp, his badge glinting under the cabin lights. Captain Coleman? The man asked, his tone formal but tinged with confusion. Jack stepped forward, offering a firm handshake. That's right. You must be Captain Harris. Harris hesitated, glancing at Emily, who stood behind him, her expression a mix of guilt and unease. I wasn't aware you were on board, he said, his voice measured. There's a lot you don't seem to be aware of, Jack replied evenly. I was supposed to be your relief pilot for the second leg. Instead, I've been relegated to economy under highly questionable circumstances. Harris's face darkened, a flicker of frustration breaking through his professionalism. Let's discuss this inside, he said, gesturing toward the cockpit. Jack followed him in, the familiar hum of the instruments washing over him like a wave of nostalgia. The first officer, a younger man with sharp features and a tense posture, looked up from his controls, clearly startled by the intrusion. "First Officer Davis, meet Captain Coleman," Harris said curtly. Davis nodded awkwardly, his eyes darting between the two captains. Jack wasted no time. "Captain Harris, I need to know why I was removed from my seat. Was there truly an overbooking issue, or was this a case of someone making assumptions?" Harris sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I wish I could give you a straightforward answer. The truth is, I wasn't informed about your presence until Emily mentioned it just now. We've had other issues to deal with." Jack's eyes narrowed. "Other issues?" Davis cleared his throat, his voice shaky. "There's been a series of irregularities on this flight. The passenger manifest doesn't match the ticket log. We've also had trouble with some of the crew communications. It's why Captain Harris and I have been focused on these problems instead of reviewing the passenger list thoroughly." Jack felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Irregularities in the manifest? Miscommunication between the crew? These were red flags for something far more serious. Emily, still standing near the door, spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought moving you would make things easier. I didn't know who you were, and I assumed." Jack held up a hand, silencing her. "We'll address your assumptions later. Right now, I'm more concerned about what's happening on this plane." Harris gestured toward the controls. "Captain Coleman, we've kept it quiet to avoid alarming the passengers, but some of the anomalies are troubling. We can't confirm that every passenger on board was properly screened, and one of the cargo indicators is giving inconsistent readings." Jack's mind raced as he pieced together the fragments of information. "Are you suggesting there's a security threat on board?" Harris's silence spoke volumes. "Have you alerted ground control?" Jack asked. "We're holding off until we have more concrete information," Davis replied, his voice betraying his unease. "We didn't want to divert unnecessarily." Jack frowned. "A delay in response could make things worse. If there's even a chance of a threat, it's our responsibility to act." Harris exchanged a glance with Davis, then nodded. "You're right. We'll notify ATC immediately. Captain Coleman, your experience would be invaluable here. Will you assist us in managing this?" Jack didn't hesitate. "Of course. But first, we need to verify those irregularities and keep the passengers calm." As Jack settled into the spare jump seat, the gravity of the situation sank in. This flight wasn't just about addressing personal prejudice anymore. Something far larger and far more dangerous was unfolding, and Jack was determined to uncover the truth. Back in the cockpit, the air crackled with tension as Captain Harris patched through to Air Traffic Control, ATC. First Officer Davis keyed in coordinates while Jack reviewed the instrument panels. The faint glow of the controls illuminated the deep lines of concentration on their faces. "I've sent a preliminary report of the anomalies," Harris said, his voice low and controlled. "ATC advised us to proceed cautiously, but no diversion unless absolutely necessary. They're flagging our cargo for review upon arrival." Jack nodded. "That's a start, but we can't wait until landing. If the manifest is wrong, we need answers now. What's in the flagged cargo?" "Non-perishable goods," Davis replied. "Mostly electronics, some medical equipment. Nothing overtly dangerous on paper." Jack's instinct told him otherwise. "Double-check the cargo logs against the physical weight readings. If there's a discrepancy, it could explain the indicator issue." Harris gestured to Davis, who began pulling up digital logs. Meanwhile, Jack leaned back in the jump seat, his mind shifting to the cabin. The atmosphere there had been tense ever since Emily's confrontation with him. Passengers weren't just curious, they were uneasy. "Captain Harris," Jack said after a pause, "I need to talk to someone who's been watching the cabin closely. Is there a senior flight attendant you trust?" Harris hesitated. "Janet? She's worked with me for years. She's stationed in economy right now." "Why?" Jack's gaze sharpened. There's a passenger, a man named Ryan, filming and observing everything. He mentioned unusual behavior among the crew and passengers. If there's something off in the cabin, Janet might have noticed too. Harris picked up the intercom. Janet, report to the cockpit immediately. As they waited, Jack reviewed the cargo log Davis had pulled up. Here, Jack pointed. The listed weight for this crate doesn't match its manifest description. It's supposed to contain medical monitors, but the weight suggests something heavier, possibly lead-shielded. That's unusual for this kind of shipment. Harris frowned. Lead-shielded? For what purpose? Before Jack could answer, the cockpit door opened, and Janet, a middle-aged woman with a calm but firm demeanor, entered. Captain, you called for me? Yes, Janet, Harris said. Captain Coleman here needs your insight. Have you noticed anything unusual with the passengers or crew during this flight? Janet nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. There's been some odd behavior, particularly from a group in row 17. 3 men boarded together, but haven't interacted since takeoff. They're seated apart, but they keep exchanging glances. One of them went to the lavatory twice in the last hour and stayed in there much longer than usual. Jack's expression darkened. Anything else? Janet hesitated. I didn't think much of it at the time, but one of them handed Emily an envelope just before we left the gate. She slipped it into her pocket, and when I asked about it, she brushed me off. Jack's instincts roared to life. An envelope? Did you see what was inside? No, sir, Janet replied. But it's unusual for passengers to hand off anything to the crew before takeoff. Harris exchanged a glance with Jack. Emily hasn't mentioned this. She won't, Jack said grimly. Whatever's in that envelope might explain why she's been so on edge. Janet glanced toward the cockpit door. What should we do about the men in row 17? Jack made a quick decision. Keep an eye on them, but don't let them know you're watching. We need to handle this delicately. He turned to Harris. We also need to talk to Emily now. As Janet exited, Jack turned back to the others. We're looking at a potential security threat. Whatever's in the cargo, and whoever these men are, we need to act fast before this escalates. Harris nodded gravely. Agreed. Let's bring Emily in and get some answers. The cockpit door closed again, sealing the rising tension inside. For Jack, the pieces were falling into place, but he knew the real challenge lay ahead. Something dangerous was brewing, and this flight had just become a race against time. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she stepped into the cockpit. The weight of her earlier actions and the escalating tension in the cabin had clearly taken a toll. Her gaze flicked nervously between Captain Harris and Jack, the latter's steady, piercing eyes making her shift uncomfortably. You wanted to see me? She asked, her voice subdued. Yes, Emily, Harris began, his tone measured. Janet mentioned that a passenger handed you an envelope before departure. Is that true? Emily's face went pale. Yes, that's true. Jack leaned forward. What was in it? Emily hesitated, visibly debating whether to answer. Finally, she reached into the pocket of her blazer and retrieved the envelope. It was plain, unmarked, and slightly wrinkled from where she had clutched it earlier. I haven't opened it, she said, handing it over to Harris. He told me it was a thank you letter for the crew and asked me to pass it along later. I didn't think much of it. Harris carefully opened the envelope, his brow furrowing as he pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. The contents made him curse under his breath. What is it? Jack asked, his voice sharp. Harris handed him the paper. Scrawled in hurried, almost frantic handwriting were the words, Row 17, watch them. They're not who they say they are. Jack's jaw tightened as he reread the note. Who gave this to you? He asked Emily, his tone calm but unyielding. Emily faltered. I don't know his name. He was an older man, balding, with glasses. I didn't think it was important. Jack exchanged a look with Harris. Do you remember where he was seated? Emily nodded. Row 22, by the window. Davis, Jack said, turning to the first officer. Pull up the passenger manifest and find the name for that seat. Davis quickly complied, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Within moments, he had the answer. Seat 22A belongs to a Mark Ellison, paid with a last-minute credit card transaction. No checked baggage. Convenient, Jack muttered. He turned back to Emily. Did you see him after takeoff? Emily's brow furrowed as she thought. No. Now that you mention it, I haven't seen him since boarding. Jack's instincts roared. Harris, we need to check the cabin. Either Ellison is lying low, or he's not on this plane anymore. And we still need to address the men in row 17. Harris nodded. Janet should be observing them already. Let's proceed carefully. Emily, Jack said, his tone softening slightly. This isn't just about a seating dispute anymore. I need you to tell me everything you've noticed, no matter how small. Any strange behavior among the crew? Passengers acting out of the ordinary? Emily swallowed hard, her professional mask slipping. Just the men in row 17. They seemed normal at first, but their interactions have been strange, like they're deliberately avoiding each other, but still communicating. And one of them keeps glancing at the emergency exit. Jack's gaze hardened. Did you notify anyone about this earlier? I didn't think it was serious, Emily admitted. It might be more serious than we realize, Jack said grimly. Harris, we need to split responsibilities. You and Davis monitor the cockpit and instruments. I'll head to the cabin with Emily and Janet to investigate. Harris agreed without hesitation. Take the radio headset. Keep us updated. Jack clipped the headset onto his ear and opened the cockpit door. Emily followed, her nervous energy palpable. As they stepped into the cabin, Jack scanned the rows. The passengers were subdued, but restless, the earlier confrontation clearly leaving its mark. Ryan, the young journalist, caught Jack's eye and gave him a questioning look. Jack motioned for him to stay put. He moved toward row 17, his posture commanding but unthreatening. The three men sat as Emily had described, separate but clearly aware of one another. Jack observed their body language. Tense shoulders, darting eyes, hands gripping armrests just a little too tightly. He approached the man nearest the aisle, a burly figure in a dark hoodie. "Excuse me, sir," Jack said, his tone calm. "May I have a word?" The man looked up, his expression neutral but guarded. "Something wrong?" "Just a routine check," Jack replied evenly. "Would you mind coming with me to the galley for a quick conversation?" The man hesitated, glancing briefly at the others. That moment of hesitation was all Jack needed to confirm his suspicions. "Sir," Jack said, his voice firm, "let's not make this harder than it needs to be." The man stood slowly, his movements deliberate. As Jack escorted him toward the galley, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger was still lying just beneath the surface, and that the secrets of row 17 were about to come crashing into the open. The galley felt like a pressure cooker as Jack led the burly man from row 17 inside. The narrow space offered little room to maneuver, and the tension was palpable. Emily stood nearby, her nervous glances alternating between Jack and the man. Janet, standing just outside the curtain, kept a watchful eye on the rest of the cabin. Jack faced the man, his tone professional, but edged with authority. "Name?" The man folded his arms, leaning back against the counter with calculated ease. "Rob! Why?" Jack didn't miss the way Rob's eyes flicked briefly toward the curtain, a quick glance, but one that betrayed his unease. "Rob," Jack said calmly, "we've noticed some irregularities with the passenger manifest. I need you to answer a few questions. Who are you traveling with today?" "Traveling alone," Rob replied, too quickly. Jack nodded, his expression unreadable. "Funny. Your interactions with the two men in row 17 suggest otherwise. Care to explain?" Rob's shoulders stiffened. "Look, I don't know what you're getting at. Maybe I nodded at someone. That's not a crime." "True," Jack conceded. "But avoiding eye contact with someone you clearly know? That's suspicious." Rob shifted uncomfortably, but didn't respond. Jack pressed on, his tone sharpening. Rob, let me be clear. We have security concerns on this flight. If you cooperate now, it'll be easier for everyone. But if you keep stonewalling, I'll have no choice but to escalate this. Is that what you want? Rob's jaw tightened, his composure cracking. Fine, he muttered. Yeah, I know them. So what? We're not doing anything wrong. Then why all the secrecy? Jack countered. Before Rob could answer, Emily's voice cut in, shaky but urgent. Captain Coleman, his pocket. Jack's eyes darted to Rob's jacket pocket, where a faint bulge was visible. It was subtle, but enough to spark alarm. Hands where I can see them, Jack ordered, his voice firm. Rob hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. Jack stepped forward, his body language leaving no room for negotiation. Slowly, Rob raised his hands, and Jack reached into the pocket, retrieving a small, unmarked device with a blinking light. What is this? Jack demanded, holding it up. Rob's expression hardened. I don't know. Someone asked me to carry it. Said it was nothing. Who? Jack snapped. Rob's silence spoke volumes. Emily stepped closer, her fear giving way to determination. I saw one of the other men. He slipped something to Rob when he thought no one was looking. It was right after takeoff. Jack's stomach sank. Whatever this device was, it had been deliberately passed to Rob under the guise of secrecy. Turning to Janet, who was still standing watch outside the galley, he said, Bring the other two men here, quietly. No alarm. Janet nodded, her expression tight with understanding. Jack returned his focus to Rob. If you want any chance of getting out of this clean, you'll tell me everything. Who gave you this? What's it for? Rob stared at the floor, his resistance waning. I don't know his name. Just a guy who said it was for backup communication. That's all. Jack's instinct screamed that there was more to the story. Backup for what? Rob opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, a sudden jolt rocked the plane. The cabin lights flickered briefly, and a startled gasp rippled through the passengers. What was that? Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Jack grabbed the radio on his headset. Harris, what's going on? Harris's voice came back, tense but controlled. We're experiencing minor turbulence, but the real issue is the cargo bay. That flagged container is triggering irregular pressure readings. We're trying to stabilize it. Jack glanced at the device in his hand, its blinking light suddenly taking on a more sinister meaning. Harris, I think this device might be connected to the cargo issues. I need you to isolate the affected bay immediately. Understood, Harris replied. As the turbulence subsided, Janet returned with the other two men from row 17. Both were visibly uneasy, exchanging furtive glances with Rob. Jack addressed them, his tone steely. You're going to tell me exactly what's going on, or I'll have no choice but to consider this a coordinated threat and act accordingly. The taller of the two men, a wiry figure with sharp features, finally spoke. It's not what you think, he said, his voice low. We're not here to hurt anyone. Then what are you here for? Jack demanded. The man hesitated, then leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. We're here to stop something, but we might already be too late. The weight of his words hit Jack like a tidal wave. Whatever was unfolding on this flight was more than just suspicious behavior. It was part of a much larger game, and the stakes were about to become terrifyingly clear. The wiry man's cryptic statement hung in the air, thick with tension. Jack stared at him, his mind racing. Too late for what? He demanded, his voice sharp enough to make Emily flinch. The man hesitated, glancing at his companions. The burly one, Rob, gave a subtle shake of his head, but the wiry man pressed on. You don't understand what's in that cargo bay, he said, his voice low. We were trying to stop it from being loaded, but they got it through anyway. Jack's gut twisted. He had dealt with high-pressure situations throughout his career, but this was unlike anything he'd ever faced. What exactly is in the cargo? The wiry man's lips pressed into a thin line, as though weighing how much to reveal. Finally, he muttered, a device. It's disguised as medical equipment, but it's a prototype that can't be activated safely at this altitude. Emily paled, her back pressing against the galley wall. Activated? What kind of device are we talking about? The wiry man opened his mouth to answer, but Jack cut him off. Enough. We're going to the cockpit. If you want us to believe anything you're saying, you'll explain it to the rest of the flight crew. Move. Jack gestured for Emily to stay behind, keeping the men flanked as he led them forward. The passengers, already uneasy from the earlier turbulence, watched the tense procession with wide eyes. Jack could feel the weight of their fear pressing against him. As they reached the cockpit, Captain Harris and First Officer Davis turned to face them. Harris's face darkened when he saw the three men. "What's this about?" Jack wasted no time. "They claim there's a dangerous device in the cargo bay, a prototype that could be activated mid-flight." Harris's expression turned grim. "Is that true?" The wiry man nodded. "The device is an experimental energy emitter. It was stolen from a lab 2 weeks ago. We've been trying to recover it ever since. It shouldn't even be here, but someone bypassed the cargo screening process." Davis frowned, pulling up the cargo manifest again. "Energy emitter. That doesn't match anything on the list." "Of course it doesn't," the wiry man snapped. "It's listed as medical monitors. That's how they disguised it." Harris fixed him with a piercing glare. "And who are you? What gives you the authority to intervene like this?" The wiry man sighed, his shoulders slumping. "We're independent contractors hired by the lab to retrieve the device. It's too dangerous to be in the wrong hands." Jack crossed his arms, his patience wearing thin. "If that's true, why all the secrecy? Why sneak it aboard instead of notifying the authorities?" The wiry man hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Because the authorities are compromised. Someone high up wanted this device out in the wild. We didn't know who to trust." Harris exchanged a look with Jack, his jaw tightening. "If what you're saying is true, then this situation is even worse than we thought." Jack nodded grimly. "Harris, we need to isolate the cargo bay. If there's a risk of activation, we can't take any chances." Harris reached for the intercom. "Janet, this is the captain. I need you to secure the aft section of the cabin. No one goes near the rear storage area without my direct authorization." "Understood, Captain," Janet replied. The wiry man spoke up again. "If the device is destabilizing, it'll emit a high-pitched frequency. That's the first warning sign." Davis frowned, pulling off his headset. "I think I just heard something like that over the comm system. I thought it was interference." Jack's blood ran cold. "Harris, we need to divert this plane. Now." Harris hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Agreed. I'll notify ATC and request an emergency landing." The wiry man grabbed Jack's arm. "If you're diverting, you have to do it fast. At this altitude, the pressure fluctuations could trigger the device. We might not have much time." Jack looked him in the eye, searching for any sign of deception. He found none. "You'd better be telling the truth," Jack said, "because if this is a lie, you've just endangered everyone on board." "It's not a lie," the man replied, his voice steady. "I wish it was." As Harris began coordinating with ATC, the faint hum of the frequency grew louder, an ominous reminder of the danger lurking below. Jack gritted his teeth, knowing the decisions they made in the next few minutes could mean the difference between life and death. "Let's do this," he muttered under his breath. The stakes had never been higher. The cockpit was a flurry of controlled chaos as Captain Harris coordinated the emergency landing with ATC. Jack stood behind him, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The faint, high-pitched hum in the background was growing louder, a sinister reminder that time was running out. "ATC has cleared us for an emergency landing at Denver," Harris said, his voice steady but urgent. "We'll begin our descent immediately." Jack nodded. "How long until we're on the ground?" "About 25 minutes if we push it," Davis replied, his hands moving rapidly over the controls. "Make it 20, Jack said. We don't have a second to spare. The wiry man, still standing in the corner of the cockpit with his companions, interjected. You don't understand. The device isn't just dangerous, it's unstable. If it's already emitting that sound, the pressure changes during descent could accelerate its activation. Harris turned sharply to face him. Then what do you suggest we do? Keeping this plane at cruising altitude isn't an option. Jack held up a hand, signaling for calm. We need specifics. What kind of trigger are we dealing with? Is there a way to stabilize it? The wiry man hesitated before answering. There's a manual override built into the device, a way to power it down, but accessing it requires opening the cargo crate. Jack frowned. You're saying someone has to go into the cargo bay and deactivate it manually? Yes, the man replied, but it's not as simple as flipping a switch. The override is buried in the mechanism, and the instructions are complex. Harris shook his head. We can't send anyone into the cargo bay mid-flight. It's too dangerous, and the pressure there is already unstable. Then we don't have a choice, Jack said, his voice firm. We keep descending and hope we can get to the ground in time. The wiry man grabbed Jack's arm, his desperation clear. If you wait until landing, it could be too late. Let me go. I know the device. I can shut it down. Jack studied him, weighing the risks. Do you have experience with pressurized environments? The man hesitated. No, but… Then it's too risky, Jack interrupted. If the bay is destabilizing, you could pass out or worse before you even reach the crate. We need someone with flight training. Harris turned to Jack, his eyes narrowing. You're not seriously considering this, are you? Jack's jaw tightened. I am. I've handled pressure changes in emergencies before. If anyone can do this, it's me. Harris shook his head. You're not just any pilot, Jack. If this goes sideways, then you'll have to land this plane without me, Jack said, cutting him off. Right now, this isn't about me. It's about everyone on board. The cockpit fell silent as the weight of Jack's words sank in. Finally, Harris gave a reluctant nod. Fine, but you're taking backup communication with you. The moment something feels off, you abort and get back up here. Understood? Understood, Jack said. Davis handed Jack a radio headset, his expression grim. Good luck, Captain. Jack slipped the headset on and turned to the wiry man. You're coming with me. If I run into trouble, you're my eyes and ears. Let's move. As they exited the cockpit, Emily appeared, her face pale but determined. Captain Coleman, what's happening? The passengers are getting restless. Jack placed a hand on her shoulder. Keep them calm. We're handling it. Emily nodded, swallowing hard. Be careful. Jack and the wiry man headed toward the rear of the plane, navigating the narrow aisles as passengers watched with wide, fearful eyes. Janet gave them a questioning look as they approached the aft section. Janet, Jack said, his tone brisk, we're going into the cargo bay. Secure this area and keep everyone clear. Understood, Captain, Janet replied, stepping aside to let them through. Jack opened the hatch leading to the cargo bay, the cold air rushing out in a sudden gust. The high-pitched hum was louder now, reverberating through the narrow space like a warning siren. Stay close, Jack said to the wiry man, who nodded, his hands trembling slightly. They descended into the dimly lit bay, the cramped quarters amplifying the oppressive weight of the situation. The source of the hum was easy to locate, a large crate marked with medical monitors. Jack approached it cautiously, the wiry man at his side. This is it, the man said, his voice barely audible over the noise. Jack inspected the crate, his fingers tracing the edges of the lid. How do we open it? The man handed him a small multi-tool. There's a latch on the side. Be careful, it's sensitive. Jack nodded, his hands steady as he worked the latch. The hum grew louder, the vibrations rattling the walls of the cargo bay. Finally, the lid popped open, revealing a complex device bristling with wires and blinking lights. The wiry man pointed to a small panel on the side. That's the override. You'll need to cut the blue wire first, then the green. But you can't let them touch, or— Got it, Jack said, already working. The seconds felt like hours as Jack carefully maneuvered the wires. One wrong move could trigger the device, or worse. Almost there, Jack muttered. Suddenly, the plane jolted, the turbulence throwing him off balance. His hand slipped, and the wires brushed against each other, sending a surge of sparks through the device. The wiry man gasped. "What did you—" Jack's voice was calm, but firm. "I've got it. Just stay back." With a final, precise motion, he cut the green wire. The hum abruptly stopped, leaving the cargo bay in an eerie silence. Jack exhaled, his hands trembling slightly. "It's done." But even as relief washed over him, a gnawing sense of unease lingered. Something about this operation didn't add up, and Jack had a sinking feeling the answers were waiting for him back in the cabin. Jack climbed back into the cabin, the wiry man close behind him. The moment they re-entered, all eyes turned toward them. Passengers stared, their unease palpable. Jack offered a steadying nod to Janet, who had been standing guard near the rear hatch, and gave her a brief signal. "It's under control for now." Emily hurried toward them, her face pale, but her voice calm. "Captain, what happened?" "That sound— it stopped." Jack glanced at the wiry man, who remained tight-lipped. "We deactivated the device. The immediate threat is gone, but I need you to focus on keeping the passengers calm while we figure out what comes next." Emily nodded, visibly relieved but still on edge. "Understood." Jack made his way back to the cockpit, his mind racing. The situation had escalated far beyond a single dangerous device. Someone had gone to great lengths to disguise the emitter, smuggle it aboard, and ensure it remained active during the flight. Why? The cockpit door opened, and Captain Harris turned, his expression a mixture of relief and wariness. "Did you secure it?" Jack nodded. "The device is deactivated, but we're not out of the woods yet. This wasn't just an accident. Someone wanted this thing on the plane." Harris frowned, his hands tightening on the controls. "Who? And why?" The wiry man, who had followed Jack into the cockpit, cleared his throat. "I told you before, the authorities are compromised. This device wasn't supposed to leave the lab. Someone with power wanted it transported covertly, and this plane was the perfect cover." "Why this flight?" Davis asked, his voice skeptical. The wiry man hesitated. "Because this plane wasn't just carrying passengers, it was carrying witnesses." Jack narrowed his eyes. "Witnesses to what?" The wiry man glanced at Davis and Harris, then back to Jack, his voice dropping. "There was an incident at the lab where this device was developed. People were injured seriously. A group of employees blew the whistle, and they were being quietly relocated to testify. At least 3 of them are on this flight." Jack's stomach sank. "And the device, was it meant to silence them?" The wiry man nodded grimly. "It's a prototype, but it's dangerous. If it had been activated during descent, the resulting surge could have been catastrophic. A perfect cover-up for anyone trying to bury the truth." Harris cursed under his breath. "We're flying into a conspiracy." Jack turned to Davis. "Pull the passenger manifest again. Cross-check it for anyone tied to that lab. We need to know who the whistleblowers are." Davis's fingers flew across the keyboard. Within moments, 3 names appeared on the screen. "Here," Davis said, pointing to the list. "Dana Lopez, Evan Craig, and Lydia Harper, all seated in economy." Jack's mind clicked into overdrive. "Do they know their targets?" The wiry man shook his head. "No. Their relocation was supposed to be secret, but someone leaked it. That's why we've been trailing the device. We weren't sure when it would surface." Jack faced Harris. "We need to secure those passengers. If this conspiracy runs as deep as he says, the device might not have been the only plan." Harris nodded. "Janet's still in the cabin. Have her bring them to the front discreetly. We'll debrief them here." Jack grabbed the intercom and summoned Janet. She appeared moments later, her composure solid despite the tension in the air. "Janet, we need 3 passengers brought to the cockpit. Lopez, Craig, and Harper. Be subtle, and don't draw attention," Jack instructed. Janet nodded. "Understood, Captain." She disappeared into the cabin, her steps purposeful but calm. As the moments stretched, Jack turned back to the wiry man. "You've been tracking this device, but you didn't know when or where it would be deployed. Who were you reporting to?" The wiry man hesitated, his unease clear. "We're private contractors, hired to recover the emitter. The lab's internal security team didn't trust official channels, so they outsourced the operation to us." Jack's jaw tightened. "And you thought sneaking aboard and keeping silent would solve the problem?" The man exhaled slowly. "We didn't expect it to escalate this quickly. By the time we confirmed the device was on the plane, we were out of options." Before Jack could respond, the cockpit door opened and Janet entered with the 3 whistleblowers. All looked understandably nervous. Donna Lopez, a petite woman with sharp eyes, spoke first. "Captain, what's going on? Janet said we needed to come here immediately." Jack stepped forward. "Ms. Lopez, you, Mr. Craig, and Ms. Harper were part of the team relocated after the lab incident. Is that correct?" Evan Craig, a middle-aged man with graying hair, nodded. "Yes." "Why?" Jack exchanged a glance with Harris. "Because the device that caused the incident was smuggled onto this flight. It's been deactivated, but someone clearly intended for it to be here. We believe you 3 might be targets." Lydia Harper gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Targets? You mean—" "Yes," Jack said firmly. "Whoever orchestrated this wanted to ensure you couldn't testify. You're not safe until this plane lands." The gravity of the situation settled over the group like a storm cloud. Dana straightened, her expression hardening. "What do we do now?" Jack's voice was calm but resolute. "We'll protect you. But there's one thing we need to know. Is there anyone on board who might be working against you?" Evan exchanged a troubled glance with Dana and Lydia. "There's a man," Lydia said finally. "We saw him during boarding. He worked at the lab, but he wasn't supposed to be here. His name is Mark Ellison." Jack's pulse quickened. "Row 22. He gave Emily the note." Evan's eyes widened. "What note?" Jack explained quickly, his mind racing. If Ellison was on their side, why had he disappeared? And if he wasn't, what was his role in this deadly game? "Find him," Harris said. "Now." Jack didn't hesitate. The final piece of the puzzle was somewhere on board, and time was running out to solve it. Jack strode into the cabin, scanning the rows for any sign of Mark Ellison. Passengers murmured anxiously as he passed, the tension in the air thick and unrelenting. Emily hurried to meet him near the galley. "Captain," she said, her voice low but urgent, "I've checked row 22. Ellison isn't there, and none of the passengers around him recall seeing him since takeoff." Jack frowned, his mind racing. He couldn't have disappeared. If he's not in his seat, he's somewhere on board. "Check the lavatories." Emily nodded and quickly moved to the aisle, directing her colleagues to search the lavatories and other secluded areas of the cabin. Jack returned to the cockpit, where Captain Harris and First Officer Davis were monitoring the descent. The whistleblowers Dana Lopez, Evan Craig, and Lydia Harper sat nervously in the jump seats, their fear evident despite their silence. "Ellison is missing," Jack said as he entered. Harris turned sharply. "How is that possible?" Jack shook his head. "It isn't. He's here somewhere, and we need to find him before we land." Just as he spoke, Janet's voice came over the intercom. "Captain Coleman, we found something in the rear lavatory. You'll want to see this." Jack's stomach tightened. "Stay here and keep the cockpit secure," he told Harris, then stepped out to head to the rear. Janet stood outside the lavatory, her face pale. "It's locked from the inside, but there's no response." Jack nodded. "Let's open it." Janet retrieved the emergency override key and unlocked the door. Jack pushed it open cautiously, revealing a chilling sight. Inside was Mark Ellison, slumped against the wall, unconscious but alive. A small syringe lay on the floor beside him, along with a burner phone. "Call the medical team," Jack ordered Janet, then crouched to check Ellison's pulse. It was weak but steady. Emily appeared, clutching the phone. "It's locked," she said, showing it to Jack. Jack grabbed the device and turned to Janet. "Stay with him. If he regains consciousness, get answers. I'll deal with this." Jack headed back to the cockpit, analyzing the phone's basic functions. While locked, it displayed notifications of recent calls and messages. One message, sent just minutes before Ellison's collapse, caught his eye. "Device compromised. Activate fallback plan." Jack handed the phone to Harris. "Ellison was taken out before he could act, but someone else is carrying out a backup plan. Check the cargo bay cameras again. Make sure the device is still secure." Davis flipped through camera feeds, his brow furrowing. "Captain, there's movement in the bay." Jack peered at the screen. A shadowed figure moved near the crate where the emitter had been deactivated. "That's not possible," Jack muttered. "We just left the bay." Harris immediately contacted ATC. "Denver, this is Flight 428. We have a security breach in the cargo bay. Requesting immediate emergency response upon landing." Jack grabbed the headset from Harris. "Harris, keep us steady. I'm going back down there." Harris looked at him incredulously. "You've already risked enough, Jack. Let the ground crew handle it when we land." "If the fallback plan involves reactivating that device, we might not make it to the ground," Jack said firmly. "I'm going." He didn't wait for a reply. Jack grabbed a flashlight and descended into the cargo bay. The air was colder now, and the faint vibrations of the plane's descent added an ominous hum to the silence. At first, the space appeared empty, but as Jack rounded the corner near the crate, a figure emerged from the shadows, one of the men from row 17. The man's face twisted into a snarl as he lunged toward the crate. Jack didn't hesitate. He tackled the man, slamming him against the wall. "What are you doing?" Jack demanded, pinning the man's arms. The man struggled, his breath ragged. "You don't understand. It's already set to reactivate during landing. I have to shut it down." Jack froze, his grip tightening. "What do you mean? You said it was deactivated." The man smirked grimly. "I lied. The only way to stop it is from here, but you won't make it in time." Jack's blood ran cold. He glanced at the crate, its lights now blinking erratically. "No more lies," Jack growled, pushing the man back. "How do I stop it?" The man hesitated, but the cold fury in Jack's eyes broke his resistance. "The panel," he said, nodding toward the crate. "Cut the black wire, then the yellow. But do it fast." Jack released him and moved to the crate. The vibrations were stronger now, the blinking lights casting an eerie glow on the walls. He grabbed the multi-tool from his pocket and carefully removed the panel. Black, then yellow. He repeated it in his mind like a mantra. With steady hands, he severed the black wire. Sparks flew, and the crate emitted a high-pitched whine. "Now!" the man shouted. Jack didn't hesitate. He cut the yellow wire. The whine faded, and the lights stopped blinking. For a moment, silence engulfed the cargo bay. "It's done," Jack muttered, exhaling deeply. The man slumped against the wall, his face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "You don't know what you just stopped." Jack's eyes narrowed. "Then you'd better start explaining." Before the man could answer, Harris's voice came over Jack's headset. "We're landing in 3 minutes. Get back up here, Jack." Jack gave the man a final glare. "You're not going anywhere until we land." The man nodded, defeated. As Jack ascended back to the cabin, the faint rumble of the landing gear deploying filled the plane. He stepped into the cockpit just as the runway lights came into view. "Brace for landing," Harris announced over the intercom. The plane touched down smoothly, the tension finally breaking as passengers erupted into applause, oblivious to the chaos that had just unfolded. As emergency personnel swarmed the aircraft, Jack leaned against the cockpit door, his exhaustion finally catching up with him. "You did it," Harris said quietly. Jack shook his head. "Not just me, but this isn't over. Not by a long shot." And as he watched Mark Ellison being carried off the plane, Jack knew one thing for certain. Whatever forces had conspired to endanger this flight weren't finished yet. But neither was he. As the passengers disembarked safely and the authorities began their investigation, Captain Jack Coleman stood tall, a symbol of resilience and determination in the face of unimaginable danger. This flight was more than a journey. It was a battle against prejudice, conspiracy, and fear. And through it all, Jack proved that leadership, courage, and integrity could overcome even the gravest of threats. The story of Flight 428 is a reminder of the strength we find in unity and the power of standing up for what's right. But this is just one of many stories that challenge our perceptions and inspire us to act. If you enjoyed this gripping tale of courage and determination, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that entertain, engage, and make you think. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode of intrigue, drama, and heroism. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay curious and stay inspired.